In the scorching summer of 1851, a peculiar pattern emerged across eastern Texas that would haunt plantation records for decades. 7 slave owners, spanning 3 counties from Harrison to Cherokee, died within 18 months, under circumstances that defied every medical explanation of the time. Each had purchased the same man, each had died within weeks of the transaction, and each death was recorded with the identical phrase in county ledgers: sudden failure of constitution. What the authorities buried in those ledgers wasn't just bodies. It was a truth so disturbing that it would remain sealed in courthouse basements until the buildings themselves crumbled. The man responsible never raised a weapon, never poisoned a well, never left a mark that could be traced. Yet he eliminated his owners with a precision that turned him into something the plantation system had never encountered: a slave who could not be owned. Before we continue with the story of Samuel Kincaid, the only enslaved man to move through 7 plantations and leave 7 widows behind, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel brings you the darkest corners of American history that textbooks refuse to touch. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from, because this story touches every corner of the South, and I want to know where my audience stands when they hear what Samuel really did. The man who would become known in whispered conversations as the Widowmaker first appeared in Marshall, Texas, during the spring cotton auction of 1850. Though his origins remain deliberately obscured in bills of sale that use 3 different birth states and 4 different ages. Marshall sat at the intersection of everything that made antebellum Texas profitable and paranoid. The county seat of Harrison County, it served as the last major stop before the Louisiana border, where cotton, timber, and human cargo moved through on their way to New Orleans markets. By 1850, the town had grown fat on cotton wealth, with brick courthouse buildings replacing wooden structures and plantation houses spreading like monuments to King Cotton across the piney woods. The Caddo Lake region provided water access. The soil ran rich with clay that held moisture through brutal summers, and the railroad was coming, though it wouldn't arrive until after the war changed everything. The white population of Marshall numbered around 2,000, with another 3,000 enslaved people working the surrounding plantations. The social structure operated with the rigid precision of a church hierarchy. Old Texas families who'd fought in the Revolution at the top, then Georgia and Carolina transplants who'd brought their slaves and their cotton knowledge, then land speculators and overseers, then poor whites who owned nothing but their skin color, and finally the enslaved who legally owned nothing at all. Into this world stepped Thomas Caffrey, a second-generation plantation owner whose father had claimed 600 acres during the Mexican period. Caffrey operated what locals called a moderate establishment. 32 enslaved people working 300 acres of cotton, with timber sales supplementing the income during lean years. He had a reputation as a practical man, neither notably cruel nor notably kind. The sort of owner who calculated profits down to the penny and viewed his labor force with the same emotional investment he gave his mules. Caffrey's wife had died of fever 2 years prior, leaving him with a 19-year-old daughter named Catherine, and a household that reflected the particular disorder of widowhood. He kept a tight budget, avoided the gambling and drinking that ruined other planters, and attended the Methodist Church with the regularity of a man who believed God rewarded discipline with prosperity. On April 14, 1850, Caffrey rode into Marshall with $600 in banknotes, intent on purchasing 2 field hands to replace workers he'd sold the previous autumn to cover debts from a poor harvest. The auction took place in the lot behind the Harrison County Courthouse, where a temporary platform served as the selling block, and buyers examined merchandise with the practiced eyes of men who'd been evaluating human bodies since childhood. Samuel Kincaid was lot number 7. The auctioneer's description noted him as male Negro, approximately 28 years of age, field-trained, no distinguishing marks or defects, papers showing clean title from New Orleans dealer. What the papers didn't show, because the New Orleans dealer had carefully omitted it, was that Samuel had been sold 4 times in the previous 2 years, each time after his owner had died unexpectedly. Thomas Caffrey paid $420 for Samuel, a moderate price that reflected neither premium quality nor suspect goods. The bill of sale was signed, witnessed, and recorded in the county ledger with the same bureaucratic efficiency that documented every commercial transaction in Marshall. Samuel walked off the platform and followed his new owner to a wagon already loaded with supplies, showing neither resistance nor visible emotion. The ride to the Caffrey plantation took 3 hours, following roads that turned from packed dirt to rutted trail as they moved deeper into the piney woods. Caffrey spoke little, offering only basic information about work expectations and the layout of the quarters. Samuel responded when addressed, using the verbal patterns expected of him, keeping his eyes appropriately lowered. What Thomas Caffrey didn't notice, what perhaps no white man could notice because the social order required them not to see it, was the way Samuel studied everything. The distance between the main house and the quarters, the location of the overseer's cabin, the rhythm of the plantation's daily routine, the relationships between the other enslaved people, the places where authority was enforced and the places where it merely assumed compliance. Samuel was assigned a cabin shared with 2 other field hands, given a blanket and a weekly ration of cornmeal and salt pork, and put to work in the cotton fields the following morning. His behavior over the next 6 weeks gave no one cause for concern. He worked steadily without being exceptional, spoke rarely, caused no disturbances. The overseer, a man named Wallace Pruitt, who'd worked for the Caffreys since before Thomas inherited the land, marked him down in his records as satisfactory but not notable. The other enslaved people, however, noticed something the white men missed. Samuel asked questions. Not the dangerous questions that challenged authority, but the careful questions that mapped relationships and routines. He learned who was favored, who was punished, who had tried to run, who had been broken by the system. He learned that Caffrey suffered from headaches that left him bedridden for days, that he took laudanum for the pain, that his daughter mixed his medicine and managed much of the household in his invalid hours. He learned that the Caffrey plantation operated on credit extended by Marshall merchants, that the previous year's harvest had barely covered debts, that Thomas Caffrey was a man walking a financial tightrope who couldn't afford another bad season. On the night of June 2nd, 1850, Thomas Caffrey retired to his bedroom complaining of one of his recurring headaches. His daughter Catherine brought him his usual dose of laudanum, dissolved in water as she'd done hundreds of times before. He drank it, dismissed her, and settled into his bed to wait for the medicine to take effect. By morning, Thomas Caffrey was dead. The discovery came at first light when Catherine knocked on her father's door to bring him breakfast and received no answer. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked because who needed to lock doors in their own house, protected by their own property? She found him in his bed, lying on his back with his eyes half open, his body already cooling in the morning air that carried the scent of pine resin through open windows. Catherine's scream brought the house servants running, and within minutes, Wallace Pruitt was dispatching a rider to Marshall to fetch Dr. Ambrose Whitfield, the only trained physician within 20 miles. The doctor arrived 3 hours later, riding hard enough to lather his horse, and conducted an examination that would be recorded in his personal journal with unusual detail. Patient discovered in state of rigor mortis, approximately 6 to 8 hours post-mortem, Whitfield wrote. No evidence of violence to the body, no unusual discoloration of the skin, no odor suggesting poisoning by common substances. Pupils fixed and dilated. Expression suggests neither pain nor fear, but rather the peaceful aspect of one who died in sleep. Upon questioning the daughter, learned that deceased had consumed his usual evening dose of laudanum for chronic head pain. Empty medicine glass found on bedside table, unwashed. Cause of death appears to be sudden failure of heart or respiration, possibly triggered by apoplexy or some sudden internal rupture. Given patient's history of chronic head pain, suspect underlying condition finally proved fatal. It was a perfectly reasonable conclusion for 1850 medicine, which understood little about sudden cardiac events, and even less about the subtle ways a human body could be induced to stop functioning. Dr. Whitfield signed a death certificate listing natural causes, failure of constitution, and departed with his $5 fee, leaving behind a plantation in sudden chaos. The funeral took place 3 days later at the Methodist Church, with Thomas Caffrey buried in the churchyard alongside his wife. Catherine, now orphaned and technically in control of the plantation but practically helpless under the legal restrictions placed on unmarried women, found herself dependent on her father's executor, a martial attorney named Benjamin Hargrove, who'd handled the Caffrey family's legal affairs for 2 decades. The plantation itself entered the peculiar limbo that followed any sudden death in the slave-holding class. Work continued because it had to continue. Cotton doesn't care about funerals, but the authority structure had decapitated itself. Wallace Pruitt maintained day-to-day operations, but he lacked the authority to make financial decisions or purchase supplies. Catherine could give orders to the household slaves, but the field operations remained beyond her proper sphere. Attorney Hargrove visited twice weekly, reviewing accounts and expenses, gradually coming to the conclusion that every creditor in Marshall had already reached. The Caffrey plantation was insolvent. 2 months after Thomas Caffrey's death, his estate was liquidated at auction. The land went to a consortium of Marshall merchants settling their debts. The household furniture, the farm equipment, the livestock all sold, and 32 human beings stood on the courthouse auction block again, including Samuel Kincaid, who'd been on the Caffrey plantation for exactly 11 weeks. The second buyer was named Robert Chandler. Chandler owned a larger operation than Caffrey. 800 acres with 67 enslaved people, a 2-story house with imported furniture, and ambitions that matched his income. He'd come to Texas from Alabama in 1847, bringing his slaves and his agricultural knowledge, and he'd prospered enough to start giving his opinions weight in county politics. He was 42 years old, married with 3 children, a deacon at the Baptist church, and a man who believed that slavery was not merely profitable, but morally ordained by Scripture. He paid $380 for Samuel, $40 less than Caffrey had paid because estate sales always went cheaper than market auctions, and transported him to a plantation that operated with military precision. Chandler ran what he called a rational system, with detailed record-keeping, scheduled punishments for infractions, and a belief that enslaved people would be productive if managed with consistent discipline. He was neither sadist nor reformer, but rather a man who'd read the agricultural journals and believed efficiency could be achieved through proper management. Samuel arrived at the Chandler plantation on August 15, 1850, and was assigned to a work gang under an enslaver named Martin Yates, a man who'd been born into slavery himself before being granted freedom in his owner's will, and who now served the system that had once owned him. The bitter irony was lost on no one except possibly Chandler, who viewed Yates as proof that the system worked. After all, hadn't he been rewarded for good service with his freedom? For 6 weeks, Samuel worked Chandler's fields, observed Chandler's routines, and asked his careful questions. He learned that Chandler suffered from recurring digestive complaints that he treated with calomel, mercury chloride, purchased from the same doctor who'd examined Thomas Caffrey's body. He learned that Chandler kept detailed ledgers of every expense and every income, ledgers that showed the plantation was profitable but leveraged, with substantial debts to New Orleans cotton factors. He learned that Chandler had a habit of personally inspecting the quarters every Sunday after church, checking for contraband, stolen goods, or any evidence of resistance to his authority. On the evening of September 28, 1850, Robert Chandler complained of stomach pains after dinner. His wife brought him a dose of his usual calomel medicine, prepared exactly as she'd prepared it dozens of times before. He took it, retired to his study to review his plantation ledgers, and was found 4 hours later slumped over his desk, his skin showing the grey pallor that his wife would describe as looking like he'd been drained of blood. Dr. Whitfield was summoned again, conducting another examination that would appear in his journal with slightly more concern than his previous entry. Patient discovered deceased at desk. Approximate time of death 2 to 3 hours before discovery. Skin shows unusual pallor and slight jaundice of the eyes, suggesting possible liver dysfunction. Known history of digestive complaints and regular use of calomel for treatment. Stomach contents expelled before death, visible in basin near desk. Death appears consistent with sudden organ failure, possibly related to chronic digestive condition. Mercury poisoning considered but dismissed, as patient had been taking calomel for years without incident. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution, aggravated by chronic digestive disorder. The funeral took place at the Baptist church, where Chandler had been a deacon. The estate went into probate, and 6 weeks later, the Chandler plantation was liquidated at auction, with Samuel Kincaid once again standing on the courthouse block, now carrying the peculiar distinction of being sold from 2 consecutive estates. The whispers started then. Quiet conversations between slaves at different plantations passed along the invisible communication network that connected every enslaved community in the county. Samuel Kincaid had been on 2 plantations. Both owners had died of natural causes within weeks of his arrival. It might mean nothing. It probably meant nothing, but people were starting to notice. The third buyer was named Daniel Hartford, and with his purchase, the pattern became undeniable. Daniel Hartford operated differently than his predecessors. A North Carolina transplant who'd arrived in Texas during the Republic period, Hartford ran what he called a Christian plantation, which meant he held prayer services for his slaves every Sunday, forbade work on the Sabbath, and believed that slavery was a sacred trust that carried obligations of care. He didn't beat his slaves. He had his overseer do it because discipline was necessary, but shouldn't be administered in anger. He didn't separate families unless economic necessity required it. He provided adequate food and clothing, by which he meant the bare minimum to maintain working efficiency. Hartford's piety didn't extend to his business practices. He owned 93 human beings across 1,000 acres, operated a cotton gin that processed crops for smaller plantations, and extended credit to neighboring farmers at interest rates that would make a Montgomery Street banker proud. He attended church 3 times weekly, quoted scripture in casual conversation, and genuinely believed he was one of God's elect, destined for salvation, while performing his earthly duty of managing the inferior races. When Hartford purchased Samuel Kincaid for $350 on November 12, 1850, he'd heard the rumors. 2 previous owners, both dead. But Hartford believed in providence, not superstition. If God had chosen to call those men home, who was he to question divine will? Besides, the price was good. The slave appeared healthy and capable, and Hartford had never been a man to let gossip influence sound business decisions. Samuel arrived at the Hartford plantation and was assigned to the cotton gin operation, work that required more skill than field labor and brought him into closer proximity to the plantation's commercial operations. He worked alongside 15 other enslaved people who operated the machinery, processed the raw cotton, and loaded bales for transport to the Marshall shipping depot. Hartford himself spent 3 days each week at the gin, supervising operations and meeting with the small farmers who brought their crops for processing. He was a visible presence, a man who believed that personal oversight prevented theft and inefficiency. He also believed in setting an example of proper Christian behavior, which meant he didn't drink, didn't gamble, didn't consort with women other than his wife, and maintained what he considered a clean household. What Hartford didn't know, what his piety prevented him from seeing, was that his clean household depended entirely on the enslaved woman who prepared his meals. Her name was Rachel, and she'd worked in the Hartford kitchen for 12 years, ever since being purchased as a teenager from an estate sale in Louisiana. She prepared every meal, measured every ingredient, and maintained the food stores with the efficiency of someone who knew that any mistake would bring punishment. Rachel noticed when Samuel started asking questions about the household routines. She noticed when he inquired about Mr. Hartford's habits, his health, his schedule. And she noticed, though she said nothing, when Samuel began volunteering to help in the kitchen garden, learning which herbs were used for cooking and which were kept for medicinal purposes. On January 7, 1851, Daniel Hartford ate his usual breakfast of eggs, ham, grits, and coffee. He attended to business at his office, reviewing accounts and meeting with a small farmer about a crop loan. He ate his usual lunch of cold meat and bread, and at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, while discussing a cotton shipment with his overseer, he collapsed. The overseer's description, given later to Dr. Whitfield, noted that Hartford had seemed fine one moment and then suddenly couldn't catch his breath. His face turned red, then purple. He clutched at his chest, gasped something that might have been a prayer, and fell to the ground. By the time they carried him to the house and summoned the doctor, Daniel Hartford was dead, his face still showing the purple discoloration that suggested he'd suffocated while his heart continued beating. Dr. Whitfield's journal entry for that day shows the first real concern. Third patient in 8 months, all plantation owners, all sudden deaths with no clear cause. Hartford showed signs of acute respiratory failure, possibly cardiac in origin. But the sudden onset and rapid progression suggest something more than natural disease. Patient had no history of heart trouble, no recent illness, no explanation for sudden collapse. Examined food stores and found nothing suspicious, questioned kitchen staff and received no useful information. Cannot shake feeling that something is wrong here but cannot identify what. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution, sudden origin. The funeral took place at Hartford's church, where his fellow deacons eulogized him as a man taken too soon by God's mysterious plan. His widow was left with 3 children under the age of 10, and a plantation she couldn't legally operate. The estate entered probate, and Samuel Kincaid was sold again, this time to a buyer who'd specifically sought him out. His name was James Whitlock, and he didn't believe in coincidence. Whitlock was different from the previous buyers. 10 years younger, Texas-born, educated at a military academy in Virginia. He'd returned home to build his own plantation through calculated risk and careful management. He owned fewer slaves than Hartford, only 42. But he ran his operation with the precision of a former soldier, keeping detailed records of every aspect of plantation life, including the health, behavior, and productivity of every person he owned. When Whitlock heard that the Hartford estate was liquidating, he made inquiries. When he learned that Samuel Kincaid was being sold from his 3rd consecutive estate, he became interested. When he discovered that all 3 previous owners had died of natural causes within weeks of purchasing Samuel, he became fascinated. On February 3, 1851, James Whitlock paid $275 for Samuel Kincaid, a notably low price that reflected the growing whispers about bad luck, and transported him to a plantation that operated under what Whitlock called strict observation. Samuel was given his own cabin, isolated from the other enslaved people. His food was prepared separately and delivered by Whitlock's personal servant. His work assignments kept him visible and accounted for throughout every daylight hour, and Whitlock himself made a point of speaking with Samuel daily, asking questions, observing responses, looking for any sign of the threat he believed existed. "You've had unfortunate luck with your previous owners," Whitlock said during their first conversation, standing outside Samuel's cabin while armed overseers waited nearby. 3 men dead. Some might call that a pattern. Samuel kept his eyes lowered, his voice carefully neutral. "Don't know nothing about that, master. Just worked where I was told to work." "And yet they all died." Caffrey, Chandler, Hartford, all within weeks of purchasing you. All of sudden illness that the doctor couldn't explain. Whitlock paused, studying Samuel's face for any reaction. You know what I think? I think you're either the unluckiest slave in Texas, or the most dangerous. Just trying to do my work, master. Don't want no trouble. Good, because I'm watching you, Samuel. Every hour of every day you're being watched. If you sneeze wrong, I'll know about it. If you so much as look at someone sideways, I'll know. And if anything happens to me... Whitlock leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. If anything happens to me, they won't wait for a trial. They'll hang you from the nearest tree and ask questions later. Do you understand? Yes, master. Whitlock straightened, satisfied that he'd made his point. He'd put the slave on notice, established his authority, and created a surveillance system that would catch any suspicious behavior. It was a rational approach to an irrational problem, the sort of military thinking that had served him well at the academy. It didn't save his life. For 11 weeks, Samuel worked under constant observation. He performed his assigned tasks, carpentry work on a new barn, repairs to the slave quarters, general maintenance around the plantation. He ate food prepared separately from the general kitchen. He slept alone in his cabin with an overseer posted outside. He gave Whitlock no reason for complaint and no evidence of wrongdoing. But Whitlock himself began to change. The stress of constant vigilance wore at him. He slept poorly, started at unexpected sounds, found himself checking and rechecking his food before eating. His wife noticed that he'd grown paranoid, jumping at shadows, making wild accusations against servants who'd worked faithfully for years. His overseer noted in his daily reports that Whitlock seemed nervous and agitated, not himself, like a man expecting attack at any moment. On April 19, 1851, James Whitlock dismissed his food taster, a young enslaved boy he'd recruited for that specific purpose, after deciding that the constant surveillance was making him look foolish. He ate dinner with his wife and children, retired to his study to review accounts, and spent 2 hours working on his detailed plantation records. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, Whitlock's wife heard a crash from the study. She found her husband on the floor, convulsing, his eyes rolled back in his head, foam at his mouth. He died before she could summon help, his body still twitching with what the doctor would later describe as symptoms consistent with epileptic seizure or possible poisoning, though patient had no history of seizures and no evidence of poison could be identified. Dr. Whitfield's journal entry that night marks a turning point. 4th death in less than 1 year, all connected to the same enslaved man. This cannot be coincidence. This cannot be natural disease. Something is happening here that I cannot explain through medicine. Have examined the body, found no evidence of poison or violence, have questioned all household staff, discovered nothing suspicious. And yet the patient is dead, and Samuel Kincaid remains alive and apparently healthy. I no longer know what I'm looking at. I no longer know if I'm seeing murder or some curse I don't understand. All I know is that recommending legal action against a slave without evidence would be professional suicide, and yet doing nothing seems equally impossible. Have recorded cause of death as sudden seizure of unknown origin. May God forgive me if I'm wrong. The estate was liquidated. Samuel was sold again. And the whispers that had started as quiet speculation became open talk throughout the slave communities of 3 counties. Samuel Kincaid could not be owned. Samuel Kincaid killed his masters without touching them. Samuel Kincaid was death itself, walking through the plantation system like divine vengeance disguised as property. The 5th buyer was a man named George Pruitt, no relation to Wallace Pruitt, the Caffrey overseer, who bought Samuel for $150 despite the warnings, despite the pattern, despite everyone telling him he was buying his own death. Pruitt was either brave or stupid, or so deep in debt that he didn't care, needing cheap labor regardless of the cost. He lasted 6 weeks before dying of what Dr. Whitfield recorded as acute respiratory distress following sudden onset of symptoms consistent with pneumonia, though patient showed no signs of illness prior to collapse. The sixth buyer, Nathan Cross, paid $90 for Samuel and died 3 weeks later from what the doctor called paralysis of unknown origin, beginning in extremities and progressing to vital organs with unusual rapidity. And the seventh buyer, William Stokes, the last man who would ever purchase Samuel Kincaid, paid $65 for a slave that everyone in the county knew carried death with him. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in eastern Texas intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because William Stokes would do something none of the previous owners had managed. He would live long enough to ask Samuel Kincaid directly how he'd done it. William Stokes was dying anyway. At 58 years old, the former Georgia planter had come to Texas in 1849 with his wife, 3 adult children, and 17 enslaved people, hoping to rebuild a fortune lost to bad cotton prices and worse investments. He'd purchased a marginal property 40 miles south of Marshall in Cherokee County, where the soil wasn't quite good enough for cotton and the timber had already been logged out by previous owners. He'd struggled through 2 years of inadequate harvests, watched his children abandon him for better prospects in New Orleans, and seen his wife waste away from consumption until she died in the spring of 1851. By August of that year, when he heard about a slave being sold cheap in Marshall because of rumors nobody sensible believed, William Stokes knew he had maybe 6 months before the creditors foreclosed on his worthless land. He knew his own body was failing. The cough that wouldn't quit, the weight he couldn't keep on, the exhaustion that made every day feel like climbing a mountain. He knew he was going to die on his worthless land, alone, having failed at everything that mattered. So when the auctioneer in Marshall offered him a healthy field hand for $65, less than a quarter the normal price, William Stokes bought Samuel Kincaid, took him back to Cherokee County, and did something none of the previous owners had considered. He asked questions. Not the threatening questions Whitlock had asked, not the suspicious interrogations that assumed guilt. Instead, on their third evening together, sitting on the porch of a house that was falling apart around them, Stokes offered Samuel a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute most slaves received, and spoke to him like a human being. "You've killed 6 men," Stokes said, his voice matter of fact, carrying no anger or accusation. "I know it. You know it. Every slave in 3 counties knows it. What I can't figure out is how." Samuel sat silent, the coffee cup in his hands, calculating whether this was another trap. "I'm dying anyway," Stokes continued, staring out at fields gone to weed. "Got maybe 6 months before the consumption takes me, or the bank does. So I'm not afraid of you. I'm curious." He turned to look at Samuel directly. "How did you do it?" The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of cicadas and the distant howl of a dog. Then Samuel spoke, his voice shedding the dialect he'd carefully maintained for 18 months. "You really want to know?" "I really do. And if I tell you, you'll have me hanged." Stokes laughed, a wet sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, he shook his head. "Boy, I'll be dead before any trial could happen, and even if I wasn't, who's going to believe a dying man's confession? They'd say the consumption had rotted my brain." He took a sip of his coffee. "So tell me, how does a slave kill 6 owners without anyone catching him?" Samuel studied the old man's face, looking for the trap, the trick, the betrayal that his entire life had taught him to expect. He found only exhaustion and genuine curiosity from a man who had nothing left to lose. "You don't poison them," Samuel said quietly. "That's what everyone thinks, but poison leaves traces. Doctor examines the body, finds evidence, you hang. You don't hurt them physically, because that leaves marks. You don't steal, because they check your cabin. You don't run, because that admits guilt." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you do is make them afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of you. Of death. Of the thing they think you might do." Samuel's voice carried a tone that hadn't been there before, something cold and analytical. Thomas Caffrey had headaches. Everyone knew it. Took laudanum every night. Same dose, same time. I didn't touch his medicine. I just asked questions. Careful questions. About his headaches, about his symptoms, about how bad they'd gotten. Asked the house servants, asked the other field hands. Made sure those questions would get back to him, like I was studying him, learning about his weakness. And he started thinking about dying. Started worrying that the next headache might be the one that killed him. Started examining every symptom, every pain, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on something in the distance. He took his usual laudanum that night, but he also took extra because he was scared, because the headache was worse than usual, because fear makes pain worse. Took enough to stop his heart in his sleep. Stokes absorbed this, his expression unreadable. "You killed him with his own fear." I made him aware of what was already killing him. The laudanum addiction, the headaches that got worse every month, the dose he kept increasing because the pain kept growing. He would have died anyway, maybe in a year, maybe 2. I just made him die sooner, on my schedule. Chandler, same principle, different method. He took calomel for his stomach, mercury medicine that was slowly poisoning him anyway. Everyone takes it. Nobody thinks about what it does over time. I just made him aware of his symptoms, made him think about organ failure, made him scared enough to take extra doses when the pain got worse. Samuel's voice remained flat, clinical. Fear causes stress. Stress causes stomach problems. Stomach problems make you take more medicine. Medicine kills you. I just started the wheel spinning. Hartford was harder. He didn't have an obvious weakness, didn't take medicine regularly. But he was pious, believed in God's judgment, believed in sin and punishment. So I let him see things that made him question his own righteousness. Small things. A conversation he overheard about slaves discussing Judgment Day. A Bible verse left open in his office to passages about false prophets. Questions asked about whether slavery was truly Christian, asked where he'd hear them but never directly to him. Samuel paused, made him doubt himself, made him question his salvation, made him start seeing signs of God's displeasure everywhere. The stress triggered his heart. Not poison, not violence, just fear eating him alive from inside. Stokes sat quietly, processing what he was hearing. The others? Whitlock was easy. He was already paranoid. Just had to feed that paranoia, make him see threats everywhere, keep him in a constant state of alert until his body broke down from the stress. Pruitt and Cross were variations on the same theme. Find the weakness, make them conscious of it, let their own fear do the work. Samuel finally turned to look at Stokes directly. Fear is the most powerful poison there is. It doesn't leave traces. It doesn't need a weapon. It just needs someone who's already sick, already dying, already carrying the thing that will kill them. All you have to do is make them see it. The silence that followed was broken only by Stokes's ragged breathing. Finally, the old man nodded slowly. "You're not a murderer," he said. "You're something worse. You're a mirror. You show men what's already killing them and let them finish the job themselves." "I'm a slave who refuses to be owned," Samuel replied. "That's all I've ever been. And now you're here, on my worthless land, waiting for me to die of consumption so you can be sold again." Stokes laughed again, that wet, terrible sound. "Except I'm not going to die that way." Samuel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. "I'm going to free you," Stokes said. "Tomorrow, I'm going to take you to Jefferson, get the papers drawn up, manumit you legally. Let you walk out of here a free man before I die, and my creditors seize every asset I own." He stood up, joints cracking, supporting himself on the porch railing. "You want to know why? Because what you did, it's the most brilliant revenge I've ever heard. You turned the system against itself, used their own weapons, their own medicine, their own fears, and you made them kill themselves while looking guilty of nothing." "They'll never let me stay free," Samuel said. "Free black man in Texas with no papers proving how he got that way. They'll sell me back into slavery within a month. Then you go north, get to Mexico, get to a free state, get somewhere they can't touch you." Stokes turned to go inside, then paused. "You know what the real horror is. It's not that you killed 6 men. It's that you proved slavery can't work. Can't really own a man who's smarter than you. Can't really control someone who understands your weakness better than you do. You're proof that the whole system is built on sand." He went inside, leaving Samuel on the porch with his coffee, and went to bed for the last time. William Stokes died 3 days later, before he could make the trip to Jefferson to file manumission papers. He died of consumption, exactly as expected, his body finally giving up after months of deterioration. His death was not mysterious, not suspicious, not anything but the natural progression of a disease that had been killing him since before he'd ever heard of Samuel Kincaid. But what happened next revealed something that the previous 7 deaths had obscured: the true scope of Samuel's plan and the reason he'd never attempted to escape despite multiple opportunities. When the Stokes estate was liquidated, a process that took less than a week given how little value remained, the county sheriff discovered something unusual in the property records. William Stokes had drafted a will 3 days before his death, a document that left everything to his creditors except for one specific item. Samuel Kincaid was to be freed upon Stokes's death, with papers filed in Jefferson confirming his status as a free man of color. The problem was that Stokes had died before signing the document in front of witnesses. Under Texas law, an unsigned will carried no legal weight. Samuel remained property, subject to seizure and sale like any other asset. The sheriff, a man named Douglas Kimball, who'd served in that role since 1848, found himself facing a peculiar dilemma. He had an enslaved man who'd been present at 7 consecutive owner deaths, a pattern that everyone acknowledged but no one could prove meant anything. He had a dead man's unsigned will, suggesting that the deceased had intended to free this particular slave. And he had a growing sense that something was very wrong about the entire situation. Kimball did what any sensible lawman would do. He locked Samuel in the Marshall jail while he investigated. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and uncovered nothing criminal but everything suspicious. Kimball interviewed Dr. Whitfield, who admitted his concerns but acknowledged he had no evidence of wrongdoing. He interviewed the widows of the deceased men, who shared their suspicions but could provide no proof. He interviewed the overseers, the other enslaved people, the merchants who'd done business with the dead men. What emerged was a portrait of improbable coincidence stretched to its breaking point. 7 men, all dead of natural causes, all within weeks of purchasing the same slave. 7 estates liquidated, 7 families disrupted, 7 fortunes scattered, and 1 man, Samuel Kincaid, who remained healthy and apparently innocent of everything except being present when death called. The legal problem was simple. Texas law recognized no crime in what Samuel had done, because Texas law couldn't prove he'd done anything. He'd raised no weapon, administered no poison, committed no violence. The fact that 7 men had died after purchasing him was, legally speaking, coincidence. Unfortunate, suspicious but not criminal. The social problem was more complex. The white community of Harrison County found itself facing an uncomfortable truth. They had no mechanism to address a threat they couldn't prove existed. If Samuel was guilty, he was guilty of exploiting the very system designed to control him. If he was innocent, then 7 men had died of random chance so improbable that it defied statistical possibility. Either way, no one wanted to buy him. The auction, held on September 15, 1851, attracted exactly 3 bidders, all of them land speculators, hoping to resell him farther west, where his reputation hadn't spread. The winning bid was $42, less than the cost of a good mule, from a dealer named Thompson who planned to transport him to San Antonio, where nobody knew his history. But on the morning Samuel was to be transferred, something unexpected happened that would seal his fate and reveal the final piece of his design. A delegation of enslaved people from 7 different plantations appeared at the Marshall courthouse, asking to speak with Sheriff Kimball. It was unprecedented. Slaves approaching white authority directly, requesting an audience, acting as if they had rights to petition. The sheriff considered having them whipped for their presumption, but something in their manner suggested this was important enough to hear. What they told him changed everything. The delegation spokesman was a man named Daniel, who'd worked the Chandler plantation and had known Samuel during his brief time there. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't implicate himself or others, but making clear that the enslaved community knew things the white community didn't. "Samuel Kincaid ain't killing nobody," Daniel said, his eyes properly lowered, his tone respectful. "He ain't poisoning, he ain't hurting, he ain't doing nothing you could hang him for, but he's teaching." "Teaching what?" Kimball asked. "Teaching us how they dying anyway. Teaching us how to see what's already there, what's already killing them. The medicine they take, the food they eat, the stress they carry. Teaching us how to notice, how to ask questions, how to make them see what they already dying from." Daniel's voice remained steady, but there was something underneath it. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. "He ain't creating nothing new. He's just showing us what's always been there." Kimball absorbed this, understanding the implications. He's training other slaves to do what he does. He's teaching us to survive by knowing our owners better than they know themselves, teaching us to see their weaknesses, understand their fears, recognize what's killing them before they do. Daniel met the sheriff's eyes briefly before lowering his gaze again. "We ain't criminals, Sheriff. We just paying attention to the men who own us. Ain't nothing illegal about that." The sheriff sat silent, realizing that the threat wasn't Samuel Kincaid individually. It was what he represented and what he was spreading. The knowledge that enslaved people could study their owners, understand their vulnerabilities, and use that knowledge to survive longer than any individual owner lived. It wasn't murder, it was evolution within bondage. Kimball made his decision that afternoon. He declared Samuel Kincaid to be a threat to public order based not on criminal evidence but on the potential for slave rebellion through what he termed psychological manipulation. He ordered Samuel held in jail indefinitely, without trial, under authority granted to sheriffs for maintaining public safety. It was illegal, unconstitutional, and completely outside Kimball's legitimate powers. It was also the only solution anyone could devise. Samuel Kincaid spent the next 3 years in the Marshall jail, held without charge, without trial, without any legal proceeding whatsoever. The county paid for his upkeep through a special assessment that everyone understood was cheaper than letting him back into circulation. He was neither slave nor free, neither criminal nor innocent, but rather an anomaly that the system couldn't process through normal channels. And then the war came. The Civil War reached Marshall slowly, more as economic disruption than military threat. The town was too far from the major battlefields to see actual combat, but it felt the war's effects through conscription, inflation, and the gradual collapse of the plantation economy that had sustained it. Cotton prices rose, then crashed. Currency became worthless. The Confederate government requisitioned supplies, slaves, equipment. And in February 1863, with Union victories mounting and the Confederacy desperate for any advantage, someone in Richmond remembered a jail in Marshall, Texas, that held an unusual prisoner. The letter arrived via military courier, addressed to Sheriff Kimball, bearing the seal of the Confederate War Department. It requested, which meant ordered, the transfer of Samuel Kincaid to Richmond for consultation on matters of military intelligence relating to enemy psychological operations. Kimball understood the real meaning. The Confederacy wanted to know if Samuel's methods could be weaponized. If one man could eliminate 7 slave owners through psychological manipulation, could that technique be taught to Confederate agents operating behind Union lines? Could it be used against Union officers, Northern politicians, anyone the Confederacy needed eliminated without leaving evidence? The sheriff wrote back refusing the transfer, citing public safety concerns. Richmond replied with a direct order from the Secretary of War. Kimball wrote again, this time detailing exactly what Samuel had done and why releasing him would be dangerous even to the Confederacy. Richmond's response arrived 3 weeks later. They didn't care about the details. They needed the weapon. On March 15, 1863, Samuel Kincaid was released from the Marshall Jail into Confederate custody. He was transported east under military guard, carried by wagon and rail through a Confederacy already showing signs of collapse. By the time he reached Richmond in early April, Union forces were tightening their grip on the Mississippi River, and the Confederacy's days were clearly numbered. What happened in Richmond was never officially recorded, but pieces can be reconstructed from letters, diaries, and scattered references in Confederate documents. Samuel was interviewed by intelligence officers, questioned about his methods, asked to explain his techniques in detail. He was cooperative, articulate, and apparently truthful, which made his information useless for Confederate purposes. Because what Samuel told them was that his methods required intimate knowledge of individual targets, long periods of observation, and circumstances that allowed him to manipulate victims' existing conditions. He couldn't teach Confederate agents to do what he'd done because what he'd done depended on being property, being present in owners' homes, being trusted enough to be invisible. He'd exploited specific vulnerabilities in specific men, using information gathered over weeks or months of careful observation. You couldn't turn that into a weapon of war. You couldn't train agents to deploy it against enemy officers. It wasn't an assassination technique. It was survival through patient understanding of the system that enslaved him. The Confederate intelligence officers realized they'd been sent a philosophical problem disguised as a tactical asset. They couldn't use Samuel Kincaid, couldn't replicate his methods, couldn't weaponize what he'd done. All they could do was acknowledge that he'd proven something the Confederacy depended on denying, that enslaved people were capable of understanding and defeating their enslavers through intellect alone. They released him in Richmond on April 23, 1863, giving him papers identifying him as free and warning him that if he was caught in Confederate territory again, he'd be sold back into slavery immediately. Samuel walked out of Richmond carrying those papers and nothing else. The city was already showing signs of the siege that would eventually fall upon it, with food shortages and inflation making daily life increasingly desperate. He had no money, no resources, no connections, but he had what he'd always had: intelligence, patience, and the ability to understand people better than they understood themselves. The historical record loses track of Samuel Kincaid after Richmond. There are no further legal documents bearing his name, no bills of sale, no arrest records, no death certificate. He vanished into the chaos of the Civil War's final 2 years, a ghost who'd proven that the peculiar institution could be defeated one owner at a time through nothing more than careful observation and the weaponization of fear. But his legacy survived. After the war, when Reconstruction brought federal troops and Freedmen's Bureau agents to Texas, a curious pattern emerged in the counties around Marshall. Former slaves, now freedmen, began demonstrating an unusual understanding of their former owners' businesses, debts, and vulnerabilities. They knew which plantations were bankrupted, which former slaveholders were desperate, which white families could be leveraged or negotiated with. They knew because they'd been taught to pay attention, taught to observe, taught to understand that survival meant knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. And though Samuel Kincaid's name never appeared in the teaching, his methods had spread through the slave communities like a virus, passed quietly from plantation to plantation, from person to person, changing how enslaved people understood their relationship with power. The Freedmen's Bureau records from Harrison County, preserved in the National Archives, contain dozens of cases where formerly enslaved people successfully negotiated for land, wages, or compensation by demonstrating detailed knowledge of their former owners' financial situations. They knew about hidden debts, about property mortgages, about business partnerships that had soured. They knew because they'd been watching, listening, understanding, not as property, but as intelligent observers trapped in an unjust system. One particularly detailed case from 1866 involved a freedman named Isaac, who'd worked the Chandler plantation. When the former overseer tried to cheat him out of promised wages, Isaac produced a complete accounting of the plantation's finances for the previous 5 years, including crop yields, sales prices, and outstanding debts. He'd memorized it all, piece by piece, year by year, waiting for the moment when that knowledge would become useful. The overseer, confronted with information he thought had been safely hidden in ledgers that illiterate slaves couldn't read, was forced to pay. Isaac later told the bureau agent that he'd learned the importance of attention from a man who passed through once, who showed us that knowing was surviving. The white community of Marshall struggled to adapt to this new reality where their former property possessed intimate knowledge of their vulnerabilities. Some former slaveholders abandoned their land entirely, unable to negotiate with people who understood their desperation too well. Others adapted, recognizing that the freedmen they'd once owned were now partners in an economy that had collapsed and needed rebuilding. But all of them learned that the relationship between enslaved and enslaver had never been as one-sided as they'd believed. The county records from that period show a dramatic increase in land transfers, contract disputes, and negotiations where freedmen held unexpected leverage. Some of this was simple economics. The collapse of the plantation system left everyone scrambling for survival. But much of it reflected a shift in power dynamics that the former slaveholders found deeply unsettling. The people they'd considered property had always been studying them, understanding them, waiting for the moment when that understanding could be used. In 1868, a traveling journalist from Philadelphia visited Marshall while documenting Reconstruction in Texas. His articles, published in several northern newspapers, noted the peculiar sophistication of the freedmen in Harrison County, describing them as more knowledgeable about their former masters' affairs than would be expected from people who were supposedly kept in ignorance. He interviewed several freedmen who spoke carefully about the importance of observation, about learning to read people instead of books, about survival through understanding. None mentioned Samuel Kincaid by name, but the journalist noted that several referred to a teacher who came through during the war years, who showed them that seeing was as powerful as reading. The journalist also interviewed former slaveholders, recording their complaints about uppity freedmen who knew too much about private business affairs. One former plantation owner, who refused to be named, told the journalist that, "We thought we controlled everything because we controlled their bodies, but we never realized they were controlling information we didn't even know they could access. They knew our debts, our fears, our weaknesses. They were always watching, always learning, and we were too blind to see it." Dr. Ambrose Whitfield lived until 1874, dying of natural causes at age 67. His journal, discovered after his death, contained a final entry dated September 1851 that read, "I have concluded that what happened with Samuel Kincaid was not murder in any legal sense, but rather something more disturbing. A demonstration that the enslaved understand their enslavers better than we understand ourselves. This knowledge cannot be unlearned. This understanding cannot be erased. And I fear that future generations will discover what it means when the observed become more knowledgeable than the observers. But Whitfield also wrote something else in those final pages, a passage that suggests he'd come to understand the full scope of what Samuel had accomplished. The true horror of the Kincaid case was never about the death of 7 men. It was about the awakening of consciousness among people we'd convinced ourselves lacked the capacity for such sophistication. Every slave who learned to watch, to listen, to understand their owner's vulnerabilities, they all became potential threats to a system that depended entirely on assumed superiority. Samuel Kincaid didn't just kill his owners. He killed the illusion that slavery was sustainable in the presence of intelligent resistance. And that knowledge, once spread, can never be contained again. The 7 widows, those who survived the war and Reconstruction, lived to see slavery ended and their fortunes scattered. Some remarried, some moved away, some lived out their lives in reduced circumstances. None ever publicly acknowledged that their husbands might have been eliminated rather than simply unlucky. To do so would be to admit that the system they'd depended on was vulnerable in ways they'd never imagined. Catherine Caffrey, Thomas Caffrey's daughter, married a Union officer during Reconstruction and moved to Ohio, where she lived until 1889. In a letter to her cousin written in 1873, discovered in a family archive in Cincinnati, she wrote, "I sometimes think about the slave father purchased that spring, the one who was there when father died. I've read enough now, learned enough about medicine and psychology to understand what might have happened. Father's laudanum addiction was killing him slowly. Perhaps that man simply made him aware of it. Perhaps he did nothing at all except exist as a reminder of mortality. I'll never know. But I think about it often, about how we convinced ourselves we were superior while being so terribly, vulnerably human." Sheriff Douglas Kimball served until 1867, when he was removed from office during Reconstruction. He died in 1882, having spent his final years insisting that holding Samuel Kincaid without trial had been justified, necessary, and the only way to prevent what he called psychological rebellion. History has not been kind to his reasoning. But in his private papers, donated to the Harrison County Historical Society in 1923 by his grandson, there's a letter written in 1870 that reveals his deeper understanding of what he'd witnessed. "I held that man in jail for 3 years without charge because I couldn't prove he'd committed a crime. But I knew he'd destroyed the fundamental assumption our society rested upon, that we were smarter, more capable, more deserving of power than the people we enslaved. He proved that wrong simply by existing and surviving. And the knowledge of his survival, the story of what he'd done, spread like wildfire through every slave quarter in the county. I couldn't stop that. No one could. The moment word got out that a slave had beaten the system 7 times, the system itself became vulnerable. The courthouse in Marshall still stands, renovated and repurposed, the auction block long since removed. The ledgers that recorded Samuel's sales have been preserved, showing the declining prices and the growing desperation of men who bought him despite knowing his history. They're artifacts of a system that believed human beings could be property, that intelligence could be owned, that some people were naturally suited for bondage. Samuel Kincaid proved every one of those assumptions wrong, not through violence or escape, but through understanding. He showed that the most dangerous weapon an enslaved person could possess was knowledge of medicine, of psychology, of the fears that haunted the men who claimed to own them. Whether he survived the war and found freedom in the North, whether he died in Richmond during the final siege, whether he lived out his days somewhere the records never reached, none of that matters as much as what he demonstrated. He proved that slavery created its own vulnerabilities, that every act of ownership created an opportunity for the owned to understand the owner, and that fear was a poison that required no bottle and left no trace. 7 men bought Samuel Kincaid, and 7 men died. Not because he killed them, but because he made them see what was already killing them and let their own fear finish the work. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying weapon isn't always the one you can see. Sometimes it's the knowledge held by those you've convinced yourself don't have the capacity to use it against you. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could Samuel have survived beyond the historical record, teaching others his methods in the chaotic years of Reconstruction? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.